That was embarrassingly nice. Thank you for that introduction. And we're just thrilled to see all of you here this morning to talk about this subject that unfortunately won't go away. I think we've known for a long, long time that if we look at the economy of America, and if we look at the performance of citizens in America, that there's a fundamental issue concentrated in our urban areas. And this issue of the underperformance of urban core areas that are often within sight of or down the street from some of the most prosperous areas in America is an issue that I think has been dogging us in the American economy for many, many years. And it was the observation of this problem some years ago when I first began working on competitiveness of states and countries and nations that led to the formation of ICIC. And the basic idea was that there was a lot of things that needed to be done to revitalize economically underperforming areas of cities. There were many human needs to be addressed. There were needs for public education. There were needs for housing. There were all kinds of needs, improving healthcare. There was all kinds of human needs. But ultimately, as we tried to address those human needs and as we worked to improve all those public institutions that were a part of delivering on those needs, that if we actually wanted to achieve success, we couldn't just do that. We also had to focus on the economy. That what we've learned from studying competitiveness all around the world is improving the kind of human fundamentals is good, but without a healthy economy, without a place where people can have good jobs with opportunity, ultimately, you don't have success. And so the really major insight of the ICIC was that we had to work on the economy too. Doesn't mean we didn't need to work on housing and public services and all those things that the Deputy Mayor just talked about. But we also had to work on building an economic opportunity in or near these urban core areas. And connect those economic opportunities to the residents of inner cities. That was really the animating idea behind ICIC, that we needed to look at the economy too, and that it was not a crazy idea. I will always remember the first round of discussions I had with a lot of CEOs and others around cities across the country, and I talked about building competitive companies in the inner city. And the first reaction was always the same. There are no competitive companies in the inner city. So I think one of the very important things early on that we discovered was there was quite a few companies in these urban core areas. Nobody knew about them, nobody paid much attention to them, and they needed a lot of support. But we had a base, we had a foundation. There was quite a bit of employment in inner city areas already. Most inner city residents had a job. The image that this was an area devoid of economic activity was completely wrong. But that economic activity was underperforming. And we needed to think about how to try to create energy and growth in these areas in their economy, just like we want to create energy and growth in the rest of the city and in the metropolitan area and even in the rural areas of this country. So that was the animating idea behind ICIC. And the organization and the team has, I think, done a remarkable body of work over the last 20 years. It seems unbelievable that it's been that long. And I think the organization, working with many of you, has contributed to learning a lot about this set of issues and about some of the things that we need to do about them.
I think today I want to say that ICIC is entering a totally new phase. And the reason is that, number one reason, that's kind of the most immediate reason, is actually that gentleman who was just standing here making that embarrassingly nice introduction to me, Steve Grossman. Steve, as many of you know, is an HBS grad. I'm very proud of that. He has been a national leader in many ways on a variety of issues over the years. He built a very strong business, which he has passed on to his sons to run. So he's a businessman. He was most recently the treasurer of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and I think we have at ICIC now a CEO that is not only a leader, a national leader, but also incredibly determined to change the trajectory of this issue. We also have a team, including Kim, who has been remarkable in starting to again accelerate the research in this field and translate it into action. And so what I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about what we learned about inner city or economically distressed urban community development, economic development, how the national context has evolved in which that economic development must take place, how we've started to understand some of the things that work, that will actually move the needle, and how we need to think about for each city or for each metropolitan area a strategy to deal with this issue. Do we have all the answers? No. Have we solved this problem from what we've learned? No. As you'll see, actually the national context, the trajectory in the US economy has actually raised the bar. It's made it even harder to do what we're all here to talk about doing, which is creating healthy economies in the urban core areas. But I have a sense of optimism that there's a growing recognition of the relevance of what we're doing, the importance of what we're doing. It's really become high on the national debate in a way that's never been before. So I'm optimistic. And one of the reasons that makes me optimistic is where we are today in Detroit. I don't know the deputy mayor. I wish I did. She's terrific. I'll get to know her. I do know Mayor Duggan a little bit. What an amazing mayor. He's just not going to not succeed. He's going to get up every day and make things better. And he believes deeply in the importance of the economy and economic development as the only ultimate path to success. And I actually know Governor Snyder as well, who's been, I think, supportive, very supportive of this idea and of the work of the leaders here in Detroit. The progress that Detroit has made shows us that you can actually make significant progress. And we have a lot of other cities, and we'll show you some data later, that are making progress. But it's still a huge challenge, and we have a long way to go. Today's session, I think, is, again, it's a joy to pull together some institutions that we've been working with for many years, in many cases. We're so happy to be at the Fed. The Fed, all around the country, has been a terrific partner to ICIC. The Fed cares about the regional economy. It also cares about the inner city. And so the Fed here has been a generous host for this meeting. The EDQ is a publication that is all about how do we advance knowledge in the area of economic development in general, but EDQ has been very supportive of really focusing work on this topic of inner cities, so we're very happy to be here with EDQ folk. Sage and Upjohn have been terrific supporters of this work. JP Morgan Chase now has become, of all the major companies in America, probably the one most focused on, kind of core economic development issues. So we're very supportive, and very happy of their support and assistance. So let me try to talk a little bit today. This is such a gigantic and complicated topic. I'm going to try not to overwhelm you with too much stuff. But this is a professional audience, and so I'm not going to be. We're gonna throw a little bit of data at you, and part of what we're trying to do here today is kind of create a foundation for a new surge and a new push in research and knowledge and data and practice in this area. So I'm going to show you a lot of stuff, and we at ICIC would be thrilled to work with and partner with and write with and do research with and do projects with and do initiatives with anybody in this room who really cares about this topic and wants to make something happen. That's what ultimately ICIC is all about. It's not a think tank, it's a do tank. The thinking is all about doing, and ultimately it's the conversion between the thinking and doing that we would like to work with you on. Now, I remember when we first started working on inner cities, we were actually back in the 90s, the early part of the 90s. And if you look at the data of that era about the performance of the US economy, we had a situation 20 years ago when, in a sense, the US economy was performing quite well. But today, I think, as we think about inner cities, those economically underperforming urban communities, we have a very different national context. And this is an area that I've worked on extensively over the last 4 years. Harvard Business School undertook something we call the US Competitiveness Project. Given our concerns about what was happening in the performance of the US economy, we set out as a faculty and as a set of colleagues to do a body of research on the US economy and really dig down into not only the performance, but also the causes of the performance. And I'd just like to give you a little bit of the highlights of that work. And the highlights are, first, that the performance of our economy, if we actually are honest, looks like something we haven't ever seen, most of us in this room, in terms of the trajectory. You know, we've had an American dream, we've had a lot of economic opportunity, we've had steady improvements in per capita income, median income. In general, the US economy has performed very, very well for decade after decade after decade. We've created a lot of jobs in the US economy. The US economy has been just a stunning job generation machine for 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 years. But starting around 2000, or 1999, or 1998, something profound started happening to the performance of the US economy, which was very troubling. We started to see job generation sputtering out in America. The number of jobs created went from 2% year after year, decade after decade, to a much, much lower rate. Obviously, the most dramatic part of that was the Great Recession. But what we found was that this slowdown in job generation and the changing character of job generation actually predated the Great Recession by at least 8 or 9 years. In some cases, even more. The economy has been performing poorly on job generation. It's performed poorly on wages. Median income, the income of the median household has actually declined in America in real terms over the last 8 or 9 years, and it's been really stagnant for a long time. And some of the things that we know drive the wage growth and income growth, like productivity growth, have fallen steadily over the last 10 or 15 years. So we have an economy that's performed very weakly, and of course the hypothesis that many had was, well, we had this terrible Great Recession, That explains it. But what we found was that actually it wasn't just the Great Recession. Most all of these trends started earlier. As we studied this at school, we came to believe that actually this was a structural problem, not a cyclical problem. That the lower performance, the lower trajectory we were on was not going to fix itself naturally, but reflected a decline in the fundamental competitiveness of the US as a place to do business. As a reflection of some things that we have not been able to keep up and reinvest in terms of our business environment. I'll show you a few points in a minute. While the US retains really fundamental strengths that every other country in the world would love to have, strengths in higher education, strengths in entrepreneurship, strengths in innovation, strengths in deep capital markets, we have a lot of profound strengths. But some of the basics have been declining. Areas like skills, relative skills of the U.S. worker versus workers abroad, public education output of how our public education system does, and others have eroded. Not so much because we are horrible, but because other countries were improving substantially and we weren't getting better. We weren't keeping up. And what the net result of this set of forces has been this divide in our economy. What we find is that the significant sized businesses in general, US-based multinationals, have been doing very well. Profitability is pretty darn good. People with skill, people who have computer science degrees, people with advanced training and advanced skills have been doing quite well. But the average worker, the average American worker, not just the average inner city worker, the average American worker has been struggling and stagnating. And actually, although there's some high-tech startups in our hot spots like Silicon Valley and New York and elsewhere that are doing really well, in general, small business is no longer performing the way it has been in America. Now, if you look at this slide, the school has now surveyed its alumni on multiple occasions and asked them a set of questions to really try to size up what are the strengths and weaknesses of America as a whole in terms of our economy. And that upper right-hand corner is our sweet spot, and luckily, it's a really big sweet spot. We have a lot of great strengths in America, and we still have those strengths, and those are not, in general, eroding. In fact, our alumni and other data suggest that a lot of these other strengths up in the right-hand upper right are stronger than ever. But what you see down here in the yellow and the red is some basics in the American economy that are either genuine weaknesses and getting worse or eroding significantly. Our legal framework. It's really costly to do business in America because of our legal framework. Our regulatory framework. It's a lot of compliance, a lot of complexity compared to a lot of other locations. Our logistics infrastructure, our roads and our highways have fallen behind. You take off at Shanghai and land at Kennedy Airport, and which is the developing country? Right. And we see that over and over again. Skills. America, traditionally, the American worker was the most skilled. But that has been declining. And then if we look over on the left, our healthcare costs, really, really high. And we're not getting great results for them in terms of health outcomes and longevity and things like that. Our K-12 system, all the metrics, if you look honestly at how our K-12 system is doing, it's been eroding. The average American used to be the best educated person in the world, if you go back 20 years or 25 years or so. But every generation has gotten worse in relative terms. because our schools are not improving as fast and setting the bar as high as we see happening in other countries. Our tax code is grossly uncompetitive. Why do you think all these companies are having tax aversion? Why are they leaving? Why are American companies being bought up by foreign companies? Because we got an uncompetitive tax system. We can fix that. But we haven't. And what's interesting is that, and I don't mean to, I'm not criticizing any of the Detroit leaders, because they're not the problem. But I think as our alumni looked at, what was going on in America, I think the number one weakness they identified was our political system. We can't get anything done. We can't move the ball in the right direction. Everybody agrees we should improve our infrastructure in America. Every single human being can't possibly not understand that. And they do, but we don't do it. We all know about the tax code, but we've had inversion after inversion, and nobody does anything about it. So we have lots of plans to improve our budget situation and create a sustainable long-term future for our budget, in our federal budget, and we haven't been able to agree on it. So I want you to understand that the context for inner cities is actually quite different than it was 20 or 30 years ago. It's gotten more challenging because the economy around us is not performing well. And with luck, we will start to see much more progress. The U.S., we got to be careful. The U.S. looks good now at this moment compared to Japan or Europe, but that's not because we're good. That's because they're awful right now for a variety of reasons. For a variety of reasons that are historical or whatever. But our performance in terms of the ability to generate improving standard of living for our citizens in general is not good. And the fundamental thing we have to do is just fix some basics that we've allowed to erode, but we're not doing that right now. So that's the context. That's the context. Now, in this context, what's the inner city? Well, I think everybody here knows, the inner city, as we define it, is the economically underperforming parts of urban areas, of cities. And what we see in many cities is we see what we call a central city, which is pretty healthy. And there's lots of jobs and employment in part of the city. But in other parts of the city, we have sort of the juxtaposition of success and challenge. And the inner city definition that we adopted at the ICIC some years ago was how to delineate, to take a city and partition it into the part of the city that was doing well, but the neighborhoods and communities and census tracts in the city that actually were economically underperforming. And this is the definition that has been used now for a number of years to develop consistent data that we can compare across cities and across regions. We've made some improvements in that over time to make it hopefully a little bit more accurate. The Detroit picture is, the Detroit is a city where still the underperforming areas dominate. And although there's a lot of progress, and I think that it's going to change, I think the healthy part of the city is still relatively small in terms of the overall land area in the city. And we can look at these circumstances in all cities across the country. And the point is that, so why do we focus on these areas? And these areas that fit in the broader economic space. So, the way we think about the economy is in the city, there's this inner city part, which is underperforming. There's the rest of the city, which is often doing pretty well. There's the rest of the metropolitan area. And then there's the rest of the country, which are often more rural areas. And the economic space in which we all function and operate consists of these four segments, if you will. And I think what we came to understand at ICIC and what we've understood in economic development is we've got to think about these a little bit differently. These are not the same in terms of economic development. When you're thinking about a rural area and you think about economic development, you can't think about that exactly the same way that you think about a concentrated urban core area, okay? But the ICIC's kind of central idea was, look, we couldn't just think about cities. We had to recognize that inner city areas were different. And we've been trying to understand how they're different. And we've been also understanding how do we actually create an economic strategy that actually will animate and energize those areas. Not just us hope that they will be driven up by the rising tide of the city as a whole or the rising tide of the MSA. Because as you'll see later, inner city success is not highly correlated with regional success. You have lots of regions that are doing well, but the inner city isn't doing well. Something different going on here. There's different circumstances, and what we have to do as we do economic development is we have to understand these different, if you will, different segments of the economy as we develop our strategy. There's some things that we can do that will benefit everybody, all segments, all parts of the region. But there's some things we have to do that really focus on the special issues of these urban core areas. Who lives in these areas? Who lives in economically underperforming urban areas in America? Well, 10% of all the population of this country lives in areas like that, 10%. They're younger, on average, than the rest of the country. It's highly diverse, much more diverse than the rest of the population. In general, have lower education levels. That doesn't mean that inner city residents don't have education. Some do, but a smaller share. And of course, lower income. In addition to higher poverty rates, in addition to higher unemployment than the rest of the region. And what really motivated the ICIC to focus on these areas was our sense that they have different circumstances for economic development. That if we're going to do economic development in inner cities, we're going to have to think a little bit differently than if we're doing economic development for the rest of the city, for example. They represent 9% of the US labor force, 10% of the population, 9% of the labor force. Workforce participation in inner cities is a little bit lower. 61% versus 64% on average for America. So 9% of the labor force are in these areas, but 15% of all unemployment is in these areas. And you see the statistic, 20% of total US poverty is in these areas with 10% of the population. And 34% of all minority poverty is concentrated in these areas, okay? So the focus on these areas really reflects the concentration of economic underperformance in certain parts of our economic space. And the idea that if we focus on those areas, we can get some leverage. We like to call it more of a wholesale than a retail approach. We could focus on economic underperformance family by family, wherever they happen to live. We could go one family at a time. And there's certain things that you have to do one family at a time. But if you want to build an economy, and if you want to really build economic success, we believe that we need to focus on these areas where poverty is concentrated, where unemployment is concentrated. Because unless we can deal with the kind of root causes of that, it's going to be very, very hard to achieve much impact otherwise. And economies are not an individual. An economy is a space where businesses transact. It's a market. We needed to think about how these inner city areas, with their concentrated underperformance, fit in the market. And where they could fit in the market. And how to get a positive trajectory developing in these regions. This was the basic initial work around the ICIC. And all the work we've done since has just simply suggested even more that we have to think this way about economic development. If we take those 4 segments of the US economy and look at success, what we find is that if you go back to 2003, when a lot of these data are this 10-year period or 11-year periods, we find that actually, if you look at the economy, the rest of the central city, the sort of healthy parts of the city, have been generating jobs. Not at hugely high rates, but they've been generating jobs over this period. Inner cities have been underperforming during this period. It's also interesting that the suburbs are underperforming. This is new. When we first started the ICIC and we would look at numbers like this, the city would do pretty well, the suburbs would do pretty well, the inner city wouldn't do well. And the rural areas have long had some challenges in terms of performance. But one of the new things that's happened is not only is the inner city challenging, but also the suburbs have not done well. If we look on average across the country, and that's true in many, many regions. But the point is that this pattern has not changed. These economically underperforming urban areas are lagging. They're continuing to lag. And this agenda of addressing these areas with a strategy that would actually change the economic direction, not just the social direction, is more important than ever.
Professor Porter, what's the weighted average for the whole thing in that last one?
The weighted average for the whole thing, I'm not quite understanding.
So, in other words, the entire economy, right?
The entire economy is growing very, very slowly in terms of jobs.
Okay, and the only part of that is growing.
And if you look overall, the only part of that is that's actually creating net jobs is actually these urban core areas.
And what's the big weighter of those when you weigh it, right? What's the one having the most negative effect? Obviously, if it's growing very slowly.
Yeah, well, this is much. These are relatively much smaller than this and this in terms of population and residents. Okay, so it would be these guys that have been really slowing down the U.S. trajectory. And here, I think the point we're just making is that these areas continue to underperform. It's not migration. It's just the average job generation rate. It's not people leaving. It's just that in the businesses operating in those areas, the job generation has been slower than average. Okay. And part of this is the urbanization trend that's going on. So I think part of this and this is probably migration. It's probably people moving into the city. And we're seeing that happening all over America. And that actually is a positive, potentially, for the inner city. Because one of the key advantages of the inner city is the proximity to the rest of the city. And if it can hook on to, it can draft behind the energy of the city, then its opportunity, if we're smart about how we do it, can improve. Okay. But these areas are the difference here has been that these areas are starting to see more challenge than historically they have for a variety of reasons we all know about. Okay. What we can see is that the cities, some inner cities have done pretty well. New York, some Texas, Louisiana areas, which Seattle. Areas that you see doing pretty well, Los Angeles. So there's some interesting areas that have done relatively well. But the overwhelming mass of inner cities are still having trouble with poverty rates and still having trouble sustaining unemployment. Indianapolis is just an example. This looks at the city of Indianapolis, and you can just see the erosion of poverty over the last 13 or 14 years in that city. So that would be typical of one of these guys down here. So Indianapolis is one of the poor performing inner city areas. We have a few other areas where things have gotten better. So And of course, we need to understand those and study those, and we will, and we do. If you look at the relationship between the city and the suburbs, what we find is there is a correlation between regional growth and inner-city growth. If you're in a very healthy region, that tends to have a positive impact on the growth of the inner city in terms of, this is employment we're looking at here, but the correlation is not very strong. Just having the region do well isn't going to solve the problem. That's what we find all across the country. And that, once again, takes us back to the need of thinking about these areas with focus. We have to think about these areas as a special focus. We can't just have a regional plan and then assume that the tide is going to rise all the boats, because it doesn't seem to work. It helps, but it doesn't solve the problem. Okay? So the question that we continue to focus on, and the need to focus on it is probably even greater, and the challenge is no less, given the overall economic U.S. context. The problem we continue to focus on is, well, what do we do about revitalizing these urban core areas, where a lot of our economic underperformance reside? The question, and the answer to that question is, well, we've learned a lot. Lots been done over the last 15 years about how to deal with this problem. There are some cities that are success stories. So what have we learned? And in order to really address the question of what have we learned, I think we have to think broadly about that. Because I think we've learned about, first of all, we've learned a lot about economic development in the last 20 years. And we've learned a lot about how to apply that learning about economic development to the actual inner city areas themselves. So let's quickly talk about that. In terms of economic development, I think the emerging framework for thinking about economic development and competitiveness is starting to reflect the fact that economic development is a multifaceted problem. And in any region or any country or any area, economic development is the juxtaposition of a number of different types of factors. In every area, we always start with endowments. Endowments of human resources, endowments of physical location. Detroit actually has a very attractive endowment in terms of its physical location. It's right on the zone by which most of the trade in Canada takes place. So it's an attractive kind of potentially gateway city. So that's an example of an endowment. If you're on the ocean, if you have a good port, if you have some natural resources, if you have those kind of endowments, that's a plus. That is a base on which you can build economic development. But in the modern economy, we've learned that economic development isn't really driven by endowments anymore. It's not so much what endowment you have, it's what you do with that endowment. If you have a good location for logistics, but you haven't put in place your logistical infrastructure, then the location is worthless, for example. If you have a pool of people, but those people don't have the right education and the right skill, then your endowment of human resources is worthless. And that leads us to the next layer of economic development, which is, well, you know that in building on the endowment, you've got to put in place sort of a sound fiscal and monetary set of circumstances. This has been critical in Detroit. You got to have a sound fiscal and monetary set of circumstances, because if you don't, that deters investment, that drives up the cost of living and doing business, and that works against your economy. So kind of getting your fiscal and monetary house in order, fiscal mostly for states and cities, is critical. So is putting in place the basic institutions and human development capacity. The school system, the housing stock, public services that work. We've learned that if you don't have effective public services and people don't have good health, care, and if people don't have basic education, that works against competitiveness and economic development. And that's what we call more macroeconomic dependence. Macro are things that cut across the whole economy. And we got to get to a certain level of quality in terms of those factors. But what economic development, I think, is increasingly learned over the last 20 years of the field is that actually a lot of the ultimate success of areas comes in the microeconomy. And micro is what happens in individual firms and industries, not the average circumstances that cut across all those. And there are really three big buckets here. One is every firm operates in a business environment, which has dimensions that we'll talk about in a minute. We got to make sure that there's a business environment that allows firms to be efficient and productive and ultimately competitive. There's this concept of clusters, and that is that when firms can co-locate in one area, which we call a cluster, related firms, that is a very, very powerful driver of productivity and innovation and job growth. 20 years ago, this was a hypothesis. Today, we have very rich empirical data to prove all this. If you have the biotechnology cluster in Massachusetts, that will be a hotspot of biotechnology innovation. That will be a hotspot of patents. That will be a hotspot of new companies forming. That's the cluster effect. It's the critical mass effect. It's the co-location effect. So when you build an economy, it's not just about the general business environment. It's building critical mass in fields where you can build some advantages, or where you can build on some advantages you inherited. And in Detroit, that was automotive. That was the automotive story for so many years that was driving the economy here. And then the third part of the microeconomy is actual companies themselves. You can't have a competitive economy unless you have competitive firms. And you can't have competitive firms unless those firms have good management and good operating practices and employ technology well and run their businesses well. And what we'll come to see is that this same set of factors is critical for inner cities too. And the more we learned, the more we understood that we had to apply, we had to address all three of these areas if we were going to ultimately have success in revitalizing these urban core areas that historically have been underperforming. The business environment, I think, no need to talk about that with a sophisticated audience like this, but the business environment is very multifaceted. There's a lot of stuff that you have to put in place to make it efficient to do business in Detroit or in inner city Boston or any place else. Access to inputs, related businesses, and so forth. A cluster looks like this. It's where there's you don't think about just firm by firm, you think about the set of related firms in a particular field. In this case, food. This is a result of a study in Boston of the food cluster. There's been interest in food in Detroit. And it's not just the retailers and the restaurants, but it's also the wholesalers and the logistical providers and the processors and the packagers and the machinery companies, and having connections to the good sourcing of the ingredients and the raw materials. And when you can put those things together and have firms in all these areas in one location, with the right surrounding environment in terms of government and regulation and so forth, that's where you have ignition and liftoff in terms of job generation and wage improvement in a given area. And we've come to understand that when we think about building economies, we have to organize a lot of what we do around these clusters, because clusters differ in very important ways. So if we're going to do education and workforce development, we need to think about, well, what are the clusters here that will determine what we need to develop for and train for? And if we're going to do business attraction, we're going to have much more success if we track businesses to come to a place where there's other businesses like them than if we're just randomly calling on firms. So we've come to understand that this cluster-based view of economic development is, again, a powerful lever. Now, a very important point for inner cities is the distinction between local clusters and traded clusters. A local cluster is a set of businesses that serve almost exclusively the local needs in their particular field. So a local cluster would be a local hospitality establishment. The demand for that local hospitality establishment is pretty much the people there that happen to be there. That's a local cluster. And a traded cluster is an enterprise that produces goods or services that are traded with other regions. Automobiles is a good example. You know, the auto cluster doesn't just produce things for people living where the production is. The auto cluster is producing products that are sold globally in many cases. And what we find is that actually most of the jobs in terms of the actual numbers of jobs are local. And this is something we didn't know until a lot of research was done. And the good news about local clusters is that they're not exposed to international competition, or even competition usually from other states. If we have a certain number of people living, you know, in this metropolitan area, we're going to have a certain number of jobs in these local clusters. And we see that the job concentration is very even across the entire country. So that's the good news. The bad news is that the average wages in the local clusters are significantly low. And that's because they tend to not be as productive, there's not as much opportunity for innovation and technology and skill. Now the traded clusters are, a little more than a third of all US employment, but they have much higher average wages, much higher rates of innovation. One of the big problems we're having in the US economy right now is almost all of our job generation right now is in the local clusters. In the clusters that have to compete internationally, we've been creating, to a first approximation, no net jobs for the last 20 years. So there's a danger sign for America. And the rebound from the Great Recession is heavily, heavily, heavily here in the local clusters. So so the point is, both are important. But when we look at economies, we've got to recognize that the dynamics of competition are different here than here. Okay, and that has some profound implications for inner cities. Okay, let's move. If you look at traded clusters, we now have copious data on every county and every region of America in terms of what clusters are there. And this small print here starts with business services. That's the largest single cluster in the economy. Education and knowledge creation is a very large cluster in our economy, go all the way to, you see the many others. And we now have sort of a comprehensive map of the economic geography of this country. In every region, every state, every metro, every city, every inner city. And we kind of know what's going on there. And what we see is this, in terms of traded cluster job generation, 2003 to 2013, compound annual growth rate, low. Wages vary dramatically by traded cluster. So some clusters like financial services are high wage and have been growing. Automotive has been, a relatively slow growth in wages, and the wages are now below the U.S. average. In terms of local clusters, we see these are the local clusters. It's a little easier to read. Health services, hospitality, local commercial services. We distinguish these by looking at how evenly distributed they are across regions. And if you see the same rough percentage of employment in logistical services in every region, then we categorize that as local at the industry level. So health has been the dominant driver of our economy in terms of jobs, of the single largest, and that may be changing, so that's a little bit ominous. In terms of job creation in local clusters, you can see here it's not like stunning growth, but it's significant growth. There have been 4.6 million local jobs created in America over the last roughly 10 years that we have data, versus 360,000 traded jobs. So you see the huge imbalance between where we're able to create new jobs in our economy. More statistics. And what we find is in inner cities, certain clusters tend to be more present. The inner city has certain circumstances that allow it to attract business in certain fields, apparel, water transportation, entertainment, performing arts, education and knowledge creation, printing, food processing, hospitality. These are the clusters that in inner cities that are present. And so when we look at any city, we're always asking ourselves, well, what do we start with? What is the base we have to build on? What fields do we have some position in? And then how can we compete more effectively in those fields? In local clusters, again, health and training and certain other area utilities, we see overly weighted in the urban core areas. So again, given the time, let's take the next step and say, okay, so we kind of understand that inner cities are different. We understand that they fit within a bigger economic space. They're not self-contained economies. They're part of a much broader economy. We know kind of from our research the kind of critical drivers of competitiveness of any region or any geography. What have we learned about inner cities? And I think what we learned is that there's really sort of a 7-point plan that you need to have if you really want to drive a change in the vitality of these urban core areas in any city. And the 7 points are here. Number one, we've got to upgrade the business environment. Because you'll never have productivity and successful businesses if you have a lousy business environment. And, the deputy mayor was talking about that a minute ago in Detroit, about improving city services and reducing, blight and things like that would deter businesses from wanting to locate there. So we got to upgrade the business environment. Number two, there's a special thing about inner cities that we've learned, and that is that in upgrading the business environment, one of your most powerful levers is what we call anchors. Anchors are large institutions that find themselves in inner cities, like hospitals, or like major universities, or like significant government entities, or like large corporations that happen to be located in those areas. Public utilities and newspapers sometimes have their printing plants and headquarters. And when you have an anchor, a large enterprise that's actually in the inner city, that anchor turns out to have disproportionate ability to move the needle, given who they hire, given their real estate development, given a lot of the other things they do. So part of any inner city strategy now that's going to have impact, we find, is you've got to engage the anchors. You've got to leverage these organizations that are really deeply rooted in the inner city. They're not going to move. Their success is affected by the quality of the inner city and the inner city's vitality and whether it's an attractive place. So there's an alignment between the anchor's goals and economic development goals for the city. And so an anchor strategy is part of any good strategy. Number three, we need some cluster thinking. We can't just think, company by company. We've got to think about clusters, because clusters are where we have critical mass, where we might be able to attract new companies, where by improving things we can help a lot of companies in the same field, where we can put in place gaps that would make that cluster more efficient and more effective. Say it's a food cluster, and we need some better logistics that will help that cluster better distribute its goods and services around the region. The cluster thinking is critical to inner city economic development. And we've got to think about the clusters as they affect inner cities, and as they provide opportunity for inner cities, and as they align with inner city residents. We need to think about how to create growth in areas that are accessible to inner city residents in terms of the skill and training required. Number 4, if we're going to revitalize inner cities, we have to improve the capability of the companies that are already there. And there's a lot of those companies. And our efforts over the years have identified, millions of inner city companies that can be improved. We've got to connect these companies better to capital. We found that one of the big things holding back growth in these companies in inner cities is that they have more trouble than they should, and than the average company, in accessing capital. It's not just that the banks don't want to lend it to them. It's not that they just don't quite know how to compete for capital. They don't quite know what lenders and equity providers are looking for. So it's an education and skill thing. It's not just it's not all about the fact that there's no capital providers around. There actually are, and we're finding more of them. And we'll hopefully have some time for Q&A in a minute. Number 6, we've got to give visibility to business in the inner city. If everybody in the community, everybody's thinking of the inner city as a place devoid of business, that's a problem. And that's what's afflicted us in so many regions. But once we start to give visibility to these companies and get these companies connected to other companies, we see some good things happening. And then finally, there's the issue of contracting. Revenue is the oxygen of business. You got to have revenue. And one of the most important things we have to make sure we do in inner cities is we got to make sure that the companies, the business base we have and can attract, has access to that revenue. And that's partly a visibility issue, and that's partly a capability issue. And I think we have more and more companies in America looking for suppliers that are local, looking for suppliers, from underperforming communities. But we need to build a bridge between that desire, increasing desire in corporate America, and the ability of the companies to supply that opportunity. So let me just talk about, very quickly, a couple of key areas. I'm going to skip most of this, but cover some of the things I think you might find particularly interesting. In terms of the business environment, no magic here. There's a lot of blocking and tackling, a lot of basics in terms of improving the business environment. And we have to work on it. And the cities that have done a good job focusing on the business environment and trying to build and improve infrastructure and build up more anchors and improve city services and things like that and worked on capital availability, they've done well. Newark is a good example. Cleveland's got a very powerful effort going in the University Circle area, which is starting to develop some traction. In terms of anchors, we already talked about what anchors are. Basically, we've come to believe that anchors have some very powerful levers for driving economic development in the surrounding community, and it's in their interest to do so. Because the hospital or the university wants a healthy neighborhood, wants a healthy community, wants people that are, earning a decent income and living in a decent quality of life. And those roles are illustrated here. So the anchor is an employer. And that employer ought to be looking for local employees. That anchor can be a workforce developer in whatever field they're in, a cluster anchor in whatever field they're in, a community developer in terms of local community assets, and a real estate developer. The real estate development power of anchors is profoundly important for changing the face of inner cities. We've seen that in many, many cities. In terms of cluster upgrading, there's increasing experience on how to do inner city cluster development. And increasingly, we're starting to make a pivot. The initial cluster work was heavily focused on B2C, food retailing, Consumer services, which are absent in inner city areas, we've done pretty well. They're now inclusive. There's B2B clusters in inner cities that become the real priority. Commercial services, other business services that will improve the business environment in those cities. And there's some examples in New Orleans of that. In terms of the company support, there's some really exciting progress happening here, which is just exhilarating. One of them that we're very proud of is the Goldman Sachs 10,000 Small Business Program, which is here in Detroit. And this really grew out of the ICIC's work, and Goldman made a massive commitment to do something about raising the managerial capacity and aspirations of companies in underperforming emerging areas. With management education and access to some business support services that they often didn't have good access to. And what this program has found is not only does this matter, a little bit of support and a little bit of raising of aspirations has meant that a lot of these companies are now growing very quickly and increasing jobs and increasing revenues. But I've been very struck by the fact that once these inner city companies or these companies in these areas get to know each other and go through this program together, what do they have that they never had before? They have a network. And it turns out that 84% of all these people that go through this 10,000 Small Business Program do stuff with each other. Because all of a sudden they have somebody to call, and they have somebody to buy from, and they have somebody to partner with, okay? This shows you that part of the problem here was just economic isolation, lack of connectivity. We all kind of know this, but it doesn't take much, frankly, to start to break this down. And the Goldman program, I think, has been a great example. In terms of capital access, lots of issues of obtaining capital in inner cities. ICIC, we are very proud of our Inner City Capital Connections program, which is really about three things. It's about some education for companies about how to access capital. What are they looking for? How do your financial statements have to be put in place? There's some stuff here. How do you pitch? How do you come up with a plan that a capital provider would get interested in? This stuff is important to capital. So it's not just that there's nobody there throwing capital at you, it's that you don't know kind of how to access it. There's the program involves some education, some coaching and pitching practice, and mentoring with folks that know how to do this. And then ultimately there's a matchmaking process where the ICIC has been finding capital providers all over America who are interested in placing capital, debt and equity capital in companies in these areas. And we make a market. And there's a big matchmaking exercise that happens this year in New York City where the companies that go through this process and that do well and are ready can then go make their pitch. And what's happened is this process has generated $1.2 billion of capital. Okay? So we can do this. We can do this. There's quite a few companies. There's more being formed. If we can equip those companies with the capabilities, and if we can equip them with some expertise in how to do this, they can raise capital. And what we find is that the companies that are able to raise capital are the ones that are growing and get on the Inner City 100 list. So there's kind of a circle here, and we have to get the flywheel moving. Business recognition we think is important. I can't tell you how many Inner City 100 winners have come up to me and said, we got on that list, the mayor had a party to celebrate our success, and all of a sudden we started getting phone calls. And people took us seriously, and we got new contracts, So literally the recognition of a business and the legitimization of the fact this is a real business, it's really successful, its high growth has made a huge impact, and the networking is related to that. And then contracting. Here we're learning. There's been all kinds of efforts to do minority purchasing and contracting over the years, but I think, once again, to be successful at contracting, it's not just declaring that you're looking for inner-city vendors. That doesn't get you there. There's a big educational component to it. Getting ready to qualify for a contract with a hospital or with a government or with a sophisticated purchaser requires some readiness and capability training. And the best efforts here that are starting to take hold are areas that are focused on making that contracting process work in a holistic way, not looking at just posting your request for proposal on a website. So I think the Inner City 100 winners, the reason they're on the Inner City 100 is those are the companies that have figured this out. And they're ones that have these large contracts. And that's why they're growing. And there's some good programs. The University of Pennsylvania did a nice program here, and others have as well. So just sort of in conclusion, I think we've found, first of all, we're in a more challenging context. But the agenda of inner-city economic development is more important than ever. We have to think about inner cities, at least to some degree, separately. We can't just lump them in the economy because they have different circumstances. If we're going to successfully revitalize these communities, we have to have a strategy. We can't just flail away. And that strategy has to hit the big buckets of factors that drive economic development: the business environment, cluster development, and company capability. We know more and more about how to do those things well. There's been lots of good experience around the country that we have to learn from, but we have a long way to go. We have a lot to learn, and the ICIC is committed to dramatically raising the bar in this area. I think with Steve is our leader, and our growing team, and our growing support from across the country, and our presence in more and more cities with our various initiatives, I'm confident that with your help and your partnerships, we can move the needle in this issue over the next, I hate to think of 20 years, that's too long. I remember when we founded the ICIC, we were hoping that it would be about 10 years. We really worked on this hard for 10 years to fix this. And that wasn't correct. This is a hard, deep problem. But it's a problem where finally now I think we have the data, we have the tools, we have the trade craft, we have the experience to kind of know what works. And I think the challenge now is to deploy what we know rigorously and aggressively across the country. And we at ICIC would love to work with all of you in that agenda. So with that, let me thank you for being here. Thank you for participating in this event. Thank ICIC's team and commend them for the extraordinary work that's going on in this organization today. It's been going on for a long time, but I just think we're seeing an inflection point, and we're very excited about that. And if we have any time, which we might not, I'd be happy to take a few questions. Okay, thank you very much.